Okay, so that's recording to now. Okay, so probably the most important thing is to just outlining to everyone to, you know, obviously the significant changes that have gone on, not just in 217, but obviously in the world that we're all feeling at the moment, and just to make sure that everyone feels supported in their learning. So that's I think a nice thing for me to connect with most of you as a course coordinator as well through this unit, but also on a unit level that I mean, I think hopefully what we always try to do is to make sure that it's the most supportive experience that we can provide for you guys, but especially at times like this, to make sure that you know that learning is important, and we want to do everything we can to keep you guys going on your units and courses and things like that. But we know at times like this, it's not always the most urgent thing. So if you need to take care of anything else during the semester, if there are things that are interrupting your ability to study, that we've got options there. So we can always deal with those options at any time, but I see this semester as one where obviously we're going to have that on a larger scale. So there's people, nationally, we're going to have, I'm sure, a lot of people who are struggling at different stages, or we might need to extend deadlines for, or maybe modify some of the assessments. So say if they can't do the group research project because something comes up during that time, or they've got to shift times around for work or whatever, that we can kind of adapt to that. Maybe potentially even moving things like group research projects into an individual type thing that you can do a certain aspect of that. So there's definitely some flexibility there. Fortunately, I'd say this unit in general is one that we probably don't have to make such significant changes as other units. Obviously, we have the online content already there and the quizzes, so there's a large chunk of the unit already online. But we do have some changes to make, because we do rely on the face-to-face sessions in previous semesters. So there's not going to be a lot that changes the dynamics of the unit and the assessments. I'll go over those briefly again with you in a second. But a lot of the details, I think, we're just going to have to work through. And obviously, we ask for your patience as well, because we're doing it on the run this semester. And so if there is any links that you find don't work, or you think that it might be helpful to have different resources, or you want to set up different times to catch up and get some feedback on certain assessments, then we're really keen to hear from you guys about how we can make it the best unit possible in these circumstances. So I guess that, the thing that we're just asking for is a bit of patience, but also mainly communication. If you are struggling individually, or as a group, you might be struggling with something, or anything comes up, then we can always provide support, but just make us aware that that's happening, and what you can do on your end and what we can do on our end to make sure we sort of continue through. Cool. So I will get some questions from you guys in a second, but what I might do is just transition from that into sort of making it, recapping what the significant changes are for 217 in the semester. And I guess we can break that up into assessments and tutorials. So from an assessment perspective, as you know, we've got 4 assessments in 217. The online quizzes are going to stay exactly the same. So we're still going to release content on a week-by-week basis, and give you that week period to do that quiz. Just a reminder that quiz is really the base level knowledge, understanding type aspect of the unit, and then obviously we try and typically we try and build on that in the face-to-face classes, so deepen our understanding, build on the application, so then we can do assessments like the mid-semester exam, the competency exam, and the group research project. Now the mid-semester exam and competency exam were both originally planned to be face-to-face in-class exams. So pen and paper, you get a question answer sheet, you answer some questions. Mid-semester exam, you get an abstract that's randomly assigned to you, and you get the same exam as everyone else. You've got the same questions, which hopefully you're pretty aware of what you're going to get before you go into that exam as well. So basically what we're doing there is just transitioning that to the exact same exam, but online. So it'll work a little bit like the quizzes you've already had online. There won't be, I don't think we're going to, well, at the moment, the plans are not to have a specific time that everyone will sit that exam, but more a period of time that you can take it in your own, when you choose. So just like the quizzes, we'll open that up At this stage, we're going to keep that in week 7. Obviously, where week 7 sits is different from what it was planned because we've had the early mid-semester break. So we're currently in week 5 of semester. So we're planning to open that up in week 7, probably at this stage, the Wednesday of week 7 through to the Sunday of week 7, because we do want to allow people that time to have that video conference that week to make sure to ask any questions and that everyone's on the same track. But we don't want to push it back too far because then it will start to move into the statistics part of the unit, and it can be a little bit tough to sort of straddle both at the same time. And I think most people will be fairly prepared for it, but we'll talk a bit more about that today with some of the research methods concepts. So that's going to be in week 7 online. It's going to be open for a period and you can sort of do it when you want in that period. The competency exam is going to run a similar way, but so online over a period, but in week 12. So that we have talked about it briefly, I think, in class a couple of weeks ago, but essentially what's going to happen is we give you a spreadsheet of data and you have got some questions to answer from that data. So you're going to have to calculate. So we're going to ask you, say, what the average is for a certain group of participants, what the standard deviation is. We're going to ask you about some skewness and kurtosis. We're going to ask you to run some t-tests and correlations and things like that. So rather than just doing it, on paper online, we're going to, have a randomized way of doing that online. Rather than doing it face-to-face, we're going to have a randomized way of doing it online. So it'll be open for you guys to do effectively in the week 12 of semester time. The group research project is going to be submitted exactly the same. The structure of the assessment's the same. We're still going to have it as group work. And so there's effectively not going to be a lot that changes, except that we were going to spend quite a bit of our face-to-face tutorial time working on the project, especially in the second half of semester. So each week we probably would have spent about a third of the class time planning, collecting data, analysing, or us giving you feedback on your analysis of data, and maybe some feedback a little bit on the starting of you writing up that project as well. Now we've got a couple of choices of how we can address that. One of those was that we could potentially supply you with some made up data from your projects. The difficulty with that is that what it takes away is a lot of the design aspect of your project, because we'd have to give you a specific data that you're going to have that research question work around. And it also takes away the data collection, which is a really important process, and some of the aspects of having your own data for the analysis as well. So at the moment, what our plan is to ask people still to work in groups. And I'll talk about how we get into groups a little bit later today. But people to get into their groups, and then we can collect data on ourselves in our groups. Typically, we wouldn't collect data on ourselves as researchers, but in this circumstance, even if you have 3 or 4 in a group, if you can just collect data on yourself at home, and the projects we can design to do that. So it might be a simple online reaction test like the one we did in class the other day. It might be a jumping measure, or it might be a timed, isometric, wall hold until failure or something like that. Simple things that we can do around the house. And even if we just have 3 or 4 our own participants, of ourselves at home, then we can, at least perform statistical analysis. Ideally, though, what we'll have is a few people, at least in the group, who are at home with other people. So I know a lot of people are probably, with their family or flatmates or something like that. And so if you can test, 2, 3, 4 other people around the house, and we pull that data together in a group, we may get up to close to 6, 7 to 10, 12, somewhere like that, which is actually a pretty reasonable amount to do some data analysis on. In terms of the actual collaboration and planning, I think we can basically replace all of that by doing it online. So I see these video conferences being much more about the project as we transition into the second half of the semester. So there still might be the first couple of minutes where we talk through a bit of the statistics activities that we're doing, but then we turn into, then we sort of break into groups and start talking about where we're at with the research project. So that's where the breakout rooms in Zoom will be handy, because I can jump in and out of those groups, and we can talk about where you're up to with your project. So that covers assessments. We're kind of hitting already there on the tutorial structure as well. So these video conferences, I think, are going to be an important replacement for the face-to-face sessions. They just allow us to not necessarily do activities online. I think that can be a little bit clunky, but what it can do is help us go over some of those trickier aspects of activities, ask some questions that I know people tend to get a bit stuck on to help them prepare for some of the assessments, and work collaboratively on the project, and ask any questions that we might have as well. So that's part of the replacement for the face-to-face tutorials. The other part is those online tutorial activities. So hopefully a number of you would have already done the Research Methods 1 online tutorial activity. You can also access the Research Methods 2 online tutorial activity now. So that went up on Friday. With those, I know that people are different spots. I know that some people haven't completed either or haven't even looked at them, and that's fine. I'd recommend you do both of those this week if you can. If you've done both, that's great. It'll help with the chat that we have today about it. If you've done one and you weren't sure when the timing was, what you were supposed to do, that's completely fine as well. We're not going to have those as hurdles in the semester. So if you don't complete any of the online activities, we're not going to stop you from getting grades in the other assessments or passing the unit. But those activities are there for you to support the scaffolding of your learning into the mid-semester exam, the group research project, and the competency assessment. And I think that you're certainly probably not in the best position if you're not completing those activities at all. So the plan, is pretty similar to what we would have done face-to-face. Each week you've got an online content and quiz, and then the following week we're really expecting you to do that contents tutorial activity just online, and when we talk about it in the video conferences as we go along as well. All right, so that's kind of the major changes assessment and tutorial wise. So I might just go around the room and see if anyone's got any questions on that. You just chime in if you've got one. Anyone there, guys? I think I mentioned it before. I'm not really too picky on this, but if you do have video, that's great to have it up so we can at least see sort of people, I can see people nodding their heads or thumbs up or things like that. I know that's not always possible, or you may not have it, so that's fine if you don't have it. But if you keep your video generally on, then they might just turn it on when you want to speak. That's great. And we'll just go around another minute or so for anyone got questions on the assessments or the tutorial changes to 217 this semester. Yep. Okay. That's cool. I might just check in with people individually towards the end as well, just to make sure that you do have an opportunity in case you're a little worried about chiming in. But do feel free. Obviously, we're going to get better at this over coming weeks. But yeah, if you've got a question at any time, then just try to chime in if you can. Usually it ends up pretty fine. It's not a free-for-all. You're not competing with other people. Just sort of turn the mic off and start speaking. I think you'll be fine. What we might do then is to get into a bit of the content from Research Methods 1 and 2. Maybe actually I could get, maybe if we could use the reactions. Can anyone give me a thumbs up reaction if you have completed Research Methods 1 or 2? Yeah, thanks Mitchell. Riley, great. Rabina, yep, awesome. Marina, great. Thanks, Jess. Okay, cool. So most people have attempted at least Research Methods 1. That's good. I think that, like I said, what I don't want to do in these video chats go through activities, I think that can be quite clunky. But I think it is a really good opportunity to hit on some things that, having some experience on how people tend to go with these activities and how we run them in class, there's definitely a few aspects that I'm quite aware that people get a little stuck on or are not very intuitive, so maybe a little struggle along. So I want to try and make sure that we cover those a little bit to get people up to speed, or to make sure you've got room to sort of ask questions. So one of those is around variables. So what is a dependent variable? What's an independent variable? The different types of independent variables, and then also how that leads into the research methods to categorization of experimental versus non-experimental. So I think people tend to struggle a little bit with that, especially with those areas. It's really hard to define what a dependent variable is. We've got words for it, you'll see in the slides, and you can Google it online, but then reading that and understanding what it is and being able to identify it in research is a really big gap. It's quite difficult to do. So I think you get that from practice. That's why we've set up the online activities that we have, to kind of just get you practice reading abstract after abstract and trying to identify what those things are. But what I want to do is give you a little, I'll talk you through an example now, and then I might ask you guys to tell me what the dependent variables are, the independent variables, any extraneous variables, and what sort of research classification you think it would be. So let's sort of think about an example where we're really interested in the effect of ice vests in maintaining or keeping a fairly sustainable core body temperature in a team sport activity. So let's say we take a group of AFL players. We know that especially pre-season time, they tend to overheat quite a lot. They struggle with the heat at that time of year. And so we already know that some teams use ice vests before game and at quarter time, half time intervals, to make sure that their players have a sort of a reasonable core body temperature. It doesn't get out of control. So let's say we want to design an experiment around whether ice vests work to reduce core body temperature. So we take a group of AFL players. Let's say we take 50, and we break them up into two groups. One group is going to have the ice vest, and the other group is not going to have the ice vest. Now, to simulate a game, instead of actually getting them out there in a game environment, let's say we simulate a game by bringing them into the lab and doing a treadmill task that kind of simulates that. So maybe they're doing some repeated sprints on the treadmills. And they're doing that in sort of the time intervals you would usually expect of quarters. The group that's been assigned the ice vest, they wear the ice vests, at before and during the breaks of that activity. And then the other group doesn't wear ice vest at all. And then what we're measuring to compare those two groups on is core body temperature. So measuring core body temperature and comparing it between the ice vest group and the non-ice vest group, who have both performed a physical activity in the lab. So with that, maybe you could tell me, or someone could tell me, and so either turn the video or the microphone on and let me know, or bring it up in the chat if you want to put it down there. But can anyone tell me what the dependent variable in that research would be? Okay, Venus, you've said ice test on the chat there. So do you mean? I'm assuming you mean ice vest. That's a good guess. I think it's probably the most common answer that we get, and it is a variable. Riley said the effect of the ice vest. What do you think? What are we seeing the effect of the ice vest on? What are we actually measuring and comparing across the two groups? Okay, body temperature. Right. So I think that's where we start to get to. Yeah, the core body temperature is the dependent variable in that experiment. So if we sort of break it down into its parts, hopefully we're seeing it as a fairly simple experiment. We've got core body temperature that we're measuring for everyone, right? And then we're comparing that data of the core body temperature post-exercise between the group that had the ice vest at the breaks and the group that didn't have the ice vest at the breaks. So the actual outcome variable, sometimes it's called, the thing that we compare groups across, is the dependent variable. What do you think the independent variable is? Anyone gonna write something down? Group from Venus there? Yeah, cool. Okay, so I think kind of between your first and second answer there, Venus, I think you've got it right. So the ice vest condition is the independent variable. So you're comparing, it's the thing you're breaking up the data and comparing on, which is the wearing of the ice vest versus no ice vest. That's the independent variable in that sort of study. Can you tell me whether that's an active or an attribute independent variable? Does anyone else want to chip in there? Mitchell, active? Yeah, it is active. Okay, so it's active because the experimenter is choosing it, is actually designing it so one group has something and the other group has another thing. Can anyone give me some examples of attribute independent variables? What's an independent variable that, yeah, cool, gender. Yep, gender's a classic one. So we might compare males and females at a particular task or a particular dependent variable. We might compare skill. So we might be comparing a group of skilled footballers versus novice footballers. So that's an attribute. So we're comparing across groups, but it's something that they come to us. We don't provide the skill. Yeah, pre-existing trait of a participant. Yeah, good one, right. So it's something that already exists. So gender, skill level, clinical conditions is a big one. So if I'm comparing a Parkinson's population versus a healthy population, I'm not deciding who's got Parkinson's and who's not. Obviously, those are traits that they're coming in with us. So that's an attribute independent variable. Now, interestingly, what a lot of people struggle with is some of the connections between some of the stuff we talk about in Research Methods 1 and some of the content we talk about in Research Methods 2, because that independent variable and the type of it plays really the dominant role in dictating what category of experimental, non-experimental the research is. So if we've got a active independent variable in this ice vest experiment of ours, does that make it classic experimental, causal comparative, descriptive, or correlational research? What do you think? I'll give you a hint that if it's got an independent variable at all, then it's going to be some form of experimental. So either classic experimental or causal comparative. So if we've got an active independent variable, is it classic experimental or causal comparative? Any ideas? Anyone willing to throw it out there? We've got a 50-50 shot now. Causal comparative out there. Riley says classic experimental. Okay, so this is, I know I'm saying 50-50 shot. It's one that people really struggle with. So it is an active independent variable is a classic experimental design of research. Think about the sort of classic chemistry type experiment where you're taking, two sort of liquids, and then you're trying to keep them as controlled as possible on things like temperature and other conditions, and then you're adding something into one of those liquids and seeing what changes. So the classic experimental is where we have an active independent variable. Causal comparative, the terminology is a bit confusing because even in classic experimental, we're trying to look for causality and we're comparing, but causal comparative is really comparing a pre-existing attribute. So that would be one where we've got an independent variable where we're comparing genders or skill level or clinical condition or something like that. So whether it's got an independent variable and the type of independent variable directly dictates the type of experimental, non-experimental research. So like I said, it's one of the ones that I know people struggle with early. And if you don't, continue to practice or wrap your head around it and put it in practice by reading abstracts and thinking about research design, then it's one that you can continue to struggle with through into like the mid-semester exam. So that is one that hopefully you can take back into those activities and start thinking about how that works and get some more practice on it. There's one other, actually what I want to do is maybe give you one more example of a research design and get you to answer sort of similar questions on the variables. So let's move away from the IceFest study and let's sort of introduce an example where we might be really interested in free throw shooting and basketball players. So let's say we take a league of basketball players and we can collect the data on free throw percentage through a season. So we're interested in that, but we're interested more specifically in the relationship between their free throw performance and their free throw self-efficacy. So how they feel about how good they are at their free throw ability. So we know that's not going to match up 100%. The better free throwers in the league aren't necessarily going to be the ones who feel that they're the best. But in general, we think there probably would be some sort of positive relationship. In general, if I feel better about my free throw performance or ability, then I'm probably going to be better. It's probably a complex relationship. Like if there is causality there, it probably goes both ways. So if I feel better about my free throw ability, it's probably going to help me in the game to be more confident and to have a higher free throw percentage. But also, if I have a higher free throw percentage, if I'm just better, then it's going to help me feel better about that. So those two things probably interact. There's probably a relationship. It's not so clear what it might be, but if we were looking for that in a research project, if we measured both free throw percentage over a season and their self-efficacy. So let's say we gave a questionnaire out to every player in the league and we got them to ask we asked them a few questions on how they would rate their free throw ability. We get some score on that. We're matching those two variables up looking for a relationship. Would there be, can anyone tell me what the dependent variable or variables are in that research? Maybe I can. Oh, Tim's out there. Free throw percentage. Yeah, that's definitely a dependent variable. Is there another one? What about self-efficacy? Free throw self-efficacy. Is that also a dependent variable? It is. It is also a dependent variable. So in that case, in the example that I just gave, we'd have both of those as dependent variables because we're not comparing one group across those two variables. We're actually looking for a relationship between those two, and so they're equal. We're not comparing. We're actually looking for a relationship between the two. So that would actually be, if we fast forward to the research methods too, that would actually be that correlational categorization of research because we're looking for relationships. It's got no independent variable. The interesting thing is we often think our research design is dependent on the variables that we choose, but it's often actually a lot to do with the type of analysis that we do. So with that same data, we could create an independent variable. Let's say that we get the whole league's self-efficacy score and we break them into the bottom quarter and the top quarter in terms of self-efficacy. So we could compare the free throw percentage between the top group of self-efficacy and the bottom group of self-efficacy, and then self-efficacy becomes the independent variable and free throw percentage becomes the dependent variable. But in the way I described it, we're not actually comparing between two groups, we're looking for a relationship between two variables. So it seems like a subtle difference, but it's really a big one in terms of our analysis, and it changes our whole research design as well. So our research then turns into, or is a correlational, not an experimental design of research. Does that make sense, guys? Maybe if it doesn't, then shout out. If it does, maybe give me a thumbs up on the reactions, or if you want to turn your video on and give a real thumbs up, you can do that as well. Cool, getting some thumbs up there, that's nice. Awesome, so that's a really one that I think is probably the biggest in terms of people wrapping their head around for the mid-semester exam from the research methods 1 and 2 type content. So, I'd probably head back into those activities, give it a go, read some other abstracts, see if you can identify those. There's probably something we'll briefly touch on again next week. I'll see where you're all at with it, maybe bring some different examples. And if you do have some other examples out there, maybe you've read an abstract and you're not really sure what the dependent variable is or what the design type of classification is, then maybe send it through to me beforehand and we can kind of talk about it in the video chat next week as well to make sure everyone's sort of getting on the right track with it. So that's one. There's just one more thing that I kind of want to mention about the research methodology content. and how it might apply to things like the mid-semester exam, because we do tend to get quite a bit of questions around some of the concepts that are a little bit more nuanced, or you may feel you're not super comfortable in giving us a really detailed answer because you're not an expert in that area of research. So one example of that is things like basic applied categorization research. So often people think about research either being basic or being applied, where in actual fact it's more of a spectrum. So most research is actually kind of a little bit basic. It gives us some information about knowledge and variables and how they work together. And it also maybe has a bit of an applied outcome. Someone could use it. But then there's research on the outer ends of that that is just applied. So maybe it's just answering a really applied problem that a group of coaches or clinicians have. And it doesn't really tell us a lot about the underlying variables or causes or things like that. But then there's research on the other side that is, just purely for our advancement of knowledge, or maybe, to advance certain methodology. So maybe it's designing the best tool to, predict body fat percentage from skin folds. That doesn't necessarily answer anyone's applied question in the outside world, but what it does do is it sets up future research to better answer applied questions. So that would be basic research. So like I said, most research actually sits somewhere in the middle. What we're not going to do is ask you this semester, is this research basic or applied, with no preface or kind of framing. What we are going to do is try and tease out your understanding of it with some of that framing involved. So what I mean by that is similar to what we've got in Research Methods 2 questions, the tutorial activity I mean, is that we'd say, okay, well, this research, is largely to advance the methodology in a particular area and doesn't necessarily answer any applied questions. So would it be, based on that, would it be more basic or applied? What do you think? So if it's just to advance a methodology in an area, would that be more basic or applied? Feel free to call it out or type it in the chat. Tim, you got any thoughts on it, mate? Tim, you there? Okay, we've got, sorry, you're there in the chat there. I'm not sure, and Mitch and Venus have both said basic. Yeah, that's it. So it's basic, yeah? So remember, so that one, in a way, the concept of underlying it should be fairly simple. If it's there, if it's answering a really applied question. So if a clinician or practitioner or someone in the real world outside of research can go and take that and use that to answer a question, then it's going to be applied research, okay? So applied in the real world. If it's not doing that, if it's advancing just our knowledge in an area, or it is addressing a methodological type question, then it is basic research, okay? So that's kind of those two. Like I said, most research is actually in the middle, but when we ask you questions on that in a mid-semester exam, we're going to ask you more about that underlying concept there, rather than give you a judgment call, or ask you to, at this stage, to give us really nuanced answers of, well, this makes it a little bit more basic and this makes it a little bit more applied, and overall I'd give it kind of this rating, because we don't really need to do that. But what we do want you to understand is what makes something basic and what makes something applied. So that's one kind of example of it. The other example where people are not particularly comfortable or get a little worried that we might be asking really difficult questions of them is the research instrumentation. So there's a lot of instruments out there in research. In fact, I'm sure most abstracts or articles you've read so far, they would go on about some sort of high-tech method of measuring blood works, or a blood pressure instrument that you've never heard of, or some sort of three-dimensional motion analysis system that maybe you've heard of in biomech, but you don't really know all the details about. And then you might get a little concerned that we're going to ask you, okay, rate its objectivity, reliability, and validity. We're not going to do that. So it's, you know, especially at this stage in undergrad, but certainly if it's not your area of expertise, you're not going to be necessarily asked about specific research instrumentations, you know, objectivity, reliability, or validity. But what we do want for you to understand, or to test your understanding of, is that you know what each of those mean, and that how each of them are important. So again, what we might do is have some framing there. So we might say, okay, well, this certain measure, this certain instrument that is used in this research, you know, is you get the same measure time after time with the same participant, same tester, but then can be quite different between different testers. And so what area of instrumentation would that be a concern in? And so then you would need to know that that's research objectivity. So objectivity is the different testers' agreement on a measure, whereas reliability is the test-retest with the same tester. And validity is the how accurately that measure reflects what you're trying to measure. That last one, validity, is a bit of a tricky one. People struggle with that a little bit. So an example is, say, skin fold measures. So you might take skin fold measures as an indicator of someone's body fat percentage. A single site skin fold measure is not a great predictor, or is not particularly a valid measure of body fat percentage. So in that way, a multiple site, a skin fold measure is going to be much more valid, or something like a DEXA scan is kind of the gold standard of validity in currently in body fat, measuring body fat percentage. Similarly, you see similar things in like biomechanics areas where you've got, you know, 2D motion analysis versus 3-dimensional motion analysis. If you're measuring things like elbow angle, using a 2D analysis for that and throwing is going to be, you know, it's very difficult to track the elbow flexion extension in 2Ds, because typically it goes through a different plane of motion, and therefore, you know, measuring 2D flexion extension of the elbow is not valid in the plane that you can see my arm at the moment, or it is here. So it's that, does it accurately reflect what you're trying to measure from that? So we need to know those, and again, you'll get prompted on those, just like in the Research Methods 2 activity, but don't worry that, you know, you'll be asked to rate instrumentation in a, you know, mid-semester exam or project or anything like that. Cool. So those are kind of the two ones there. Does anyone have any questions about any of the Research Methodology 1 or 2 content, how you might be progressing in the activities or headed towards the mid-semester exam? No, feel free to chime in on the chat, or switch on your mic if you do have a question. Okay, cool. Well, then we might just transition to the last thing that I've got on my agenda today, which is the group research project. So I already mentioned it briefly in terms of how we're going to structure that a little differently to collaborate online. But what I might do now is just share my screen and show you what we're expecting of the next steps. So let me just share this with you. Okay, can I get maybe some thumbs up if you can see my screen there, just to double check? Yep, cool, thanks Jess. Okay, so we've got the Leo site here. And then what we've got down in the group research project, you'll notice here, my view is obviously a little different because I can edit some of these things. But you notice at the very top, we've got the group sign up now. So all these are the same. Hopefully most of you have had a look through things like the topics, the outline, the marking criteria, and none of that's going to change based on the what we're doing in 217 now. But obviously what we haven't had a chance to do is have a face-to-face class where we've got into groups with each other. So what I've created here is a little link to a Google Doc. So if you're on Leo at the moment, I'd encourage you to kind of click on that right now just to double check that you can write your name in there. You'll see at the bottom here, we've got 3 different classes. So Monday 12 p.m, Tuesday 10 a.m, and Tuesday 12 p.m. So you guys are in the Tuesday 12 p.m. Hopefully you see your name on the class list down here. And then you can put your name down together with others in a group. Ideally, really what we want is by the end of this week for you guys to identify who's in your group, identify a project topic based on the ones that are outlined in Leo there, and create a Google Doc that you all have access to. The Google Doc serves a few different purposes. One is to just as an online space for you guys to collaborate and start building the items or the different aspects of the group research project. Another one is for us to be able to provide you feedback. So if we have access to that on this page here, then I can jump in there and you might say, okay, well, Matt, we're struggling a little bit with the participant information sheet, or can you just check over this for us? And so when we do that on the online sessions or even offline or outside of those online sessions, moving forward, I can jump into the Google Docs and just see those easily rather than having to send all the documents back and forth. And the final reason is kind of the cool thing about another good aspect about Google Docs is it tracks the activity that people have over time. So that we're not going to use that as you're going to get a certain percentage or less or whatever for the project, but especially with a semester like this, if we haven't heard from someone in a week via the emails or the video chats, then we might also check the Google Doc for their project. And if that person's not been on the Google Doc for a little while, then we know that maybe something's happened. Maybe they're unwell or whatever, and we might just move into different processes of having them do an individual project, and then the rest of the group can keep moving forward rather than getting stuck on certain aspects of the project. So I think the Google Doc serves a few different purposes there. So by the end of the week, like I said, what I'd like is for everyone to be in a group, to have a group project topic, and to have a Google Doc that's linked between all their group members and start working or planning towards different aspects of the project. You don't have to get a lot down. We're not going to go through it too much in detail today, but next week what I would like to do is use the breakout rooms in the video chat for people in their projects to get into those groups and start chatting with each other there, and I can drop in and see where everyone's at and start working out the design of projects. Cool, okay, I can see a few people have logged into it. Can anyone just write their name down just to make sure? It's always good to check with these settings whether you can write it in, because sometimes it's read only. So I'm pretty sure I've got it on editable, but if someone could write their name in, that would help. Check that. Okay, has anyone put that in and it's not appeared up there yet? I'm not seeing any in there. I'll just reload it. Okay. I can see people are logging in, but I can't see any names. Just double check this. Yeah, it should be editable. Okay, so we've got someone's on there. We can see a few cursors moving around. I'll just give you a second to try and edit that. Put your name down if you can. While you're doing that, I might just talk a little about just highlight a few different areas of the group research project that you probably want to sort of pay attention to over the next week or two as you're planning. So one of those obviously is the possible topics. So we've got 4 very broad topics here, which you can design an almost endless amount of projects or questions within. So things like, if we take the first one, the effect of music on strength, that can be any type of music. You could be comparing things like the tempo of music. You could be comparing music versus no music. You can be comparing the volume of 2 different music volume conditions. And strength, you could do any sort of strength. You could do an isometric hold against a wall. You could do a lifting exercise. You could even bend those topics. I don't mind if you push them to the edges or even go outside a little. So you might say, okay, how many push-ups can you do in 2 different musical conditions? Is that testing purely strength? Maybe not, but it's close enough. And I think that, anything you want to design within there is fine. The reason really we just have topics in general, I'm quite happy to people design their own stuff, is primarily so just to give people ideas of what they might be doing. I think if we just go to the, choose anything in exercise science, then people tend to struggle to focus some of those areas down a little bit. So, if you do want to go to the edges of these or a little bit more outside of those, that's fine. Just let us know as we move through the weeks. The other thing I'd sort of mention at this point with the topics as well is, and you don't have to decide on them straight away, you can look into a few different ones, but there's going to be this kind of continuous cycle of going back and forth with the literature in those areas. So there's probably aspects of these areas that you've never heard of that are fairly common in the literature. So for example, effective exercise on mood states. People might look at that and without looking at the literature, they might start to design their own questions around how you rate someone's mood. But if you go into the literature, what you'd find is probably the most common tool and simple, easy tool to measure someone's mood state is the POMS. And so that's basically it tests, there's ready-made questions for all sorts of different mood states, dozens of different types of mood. And so what you might do is take 1 or 2 of those moods and just take the questions for those and design a little a questionnaire around that might only take a minute or something for people to complete. And then you can have the effect of exercise on that mood state or some interaction between those mood states and any exercise you want to choose. Dive into those, have a look at what the literature is talking about, look at that for methodology, but also for gaps. Now, there's kind of 2, at this point, there's question that people have is, should I do research somewhere where there's a big gap in the literature and that no one's done that research? Or should it be an area of the research where someone has done research, but we're going fairly close but slightly different to that? And it could be either of those. So it's certainly a pretty strong base if you find a project that is pretty similar to a question you want to answer, and you want to use a large portion of that, but then change something small about it. So maybe you've seen a research design doing, music and strength or exercise and mood state or something like that, and you want to basically use the same methods, but test it on a shorter exercise program. So they've done like a 20-minute exercise and measured a certain mood state, and you want to see if a 5-minute exercise is going to affect the mood state. Or maybe you're doing it on a different population. So maybe it's being tested on a group of athletes, or it's just males in the sample in that particular study, and you want to test it on females. So going pretty close to what someone else has done in the past, replicating that essentially with a slightly different population or test can be a really good way to go. But also you might just see a really big gap when no one's done research in a certain area and you want to go into that and discover something about it. And that's really good as well. But just be aware of where it sits in that literature as you go into it. And it's going to be continuous asking the question, designing an experiment, looking back at the literature, going back and designing a bit more question, going back to the literature. So that's with respect to the project topics. The other thing I just point you towards is all of the outlines, the templates and the marking criteria. So you don't need to write, well, I guess for the best guide on filling out the application form, filling out an information sheet, consent form, and abstract. All the templates are here. You could literally put those up on the Google Doc and start writing into those, and you've got the formatting and prompts and all those things there for you. So they're going to be a major help, but continuously refer back to the marking criteria would be my suggestion. So what you've got in here is not just things that are on those sheets, and also you've got an idea of what's more valuable. A lot of people spend a lot of time worrying about the tick boxes in the application form. They're only worth a very small percentage, and there's a lot of questions it doesn't really matter if you tick yes or no, okay? So I wouldn't spend too much time on that. There's others though that spend very little time on the description of procedures, only put a few things in there, where that's worth the bulk of the marks for that application form. So that is something that you'd want to be really good, including a brief justification of research, which is kind of like an introduction section. So another example is the petitioner information sheet. So people will see on the template that it's prompting you to outline the procedures relevant to the participant. That's great. But it doesn't prompt you in that template to outline the risks and how the steps taken ensure to minimize the risks. That is a really important part of the criteria that we were expecting from the information sheet. So if you're going through those systematically and continuing to check that you've got the really important stuff in there, then you're going to do quite well in the project. But you will miss out on marks if you're not continuously referring back to that marking criteria and seeing where it's important to get marks. Cool. Okay, I can see people have edited the group sign up there. So what I might do is head back into or stop sharing my screen. Okay, so has anyone got any questions with the group research project at all and the next steps?
Hello. Hey.
Hey, who's that? Is that Tim?
Yeah, that's it.
I'm not quite hearing you there, so if you maybe speak up a little bit.
Sorry, I'm on an online conference for uni. I didn't see your call. I texted you.
Okay. This is Tim, is it?
Okay, thank you.
Tim, I think you might be on, you might have your microphone unmuted there. You might have chatted to someone else. Okay, Harriet's just asked me if hers is on the page there. I've got one that has Venus and Jessica, but I don't have Flo or Harriet. I do have another group that's got Tim and Mitch. So no, I don't have that one. I don't have that one completely yet, Harriet. So maybe just maybe have another go at putting that down, or let me know if you're putting it down, it's not showing up when you re-enter the page. Mitchell's asked a question about how many people we need per group for the group research project. That's a good one, 3 to 4. If you lose someone, and say you have 3 or 4 and you lose someone over time, then we have had people complete it in a pair before. Like I said, we can modify it a little bit if something goes wrong during the semester and we want to put you on a different timeline. We can have it as an individual project. More than 4 starts to suffer with a little bit of contribution issues. Not even so much that people aren't participating, but more it's actually quite difficult to coordinate 5 people working together in that group research project. So yeah, 3 to 4 is the ideal. Any other questions on the group research project at all, guys? All right. So what I might finish, well, actually, I might do 2 things to finish. One is just to go around the room and ask you individually if if everything's okay. And then the other one is to finish off with some playing around with the breakout rooms. So I can see from the sheet already and what you guys have put in the chat that there's, okay, there has actually, Harriet, there is your group up now. So what I might do is throw people into or sign them up into some of the breakout rooms based on what they've just put on. You just put on the project sheet. That may or may not be who you end up going with, but just to give us a practice for a minute or two to finish off with. But before we do that, before we head into those, I just want to kind of go around to everyone and make sure that everyone's okay with things. So Florina, everything's good. You got any other questions for us? All good, great. Harriet? Nice one. Jess? All good. Tim Fox? Thanks, Tim. Rabina? Nice one. Mitchell? Yeah, good question. So if you're not seeing the chat right now, Mitch has just asked, other than choosing group members, is there anything specific that we can get started on the assignments? I think other than group members and a topic, probably the other next steps, if you want to get started a little bit more going on it this week, is to start thinking about a design. So thinking about some of the stuff we've been talking about, like what are your variables? What are you actually going to be measuring as a dependent variable? What are you thinking of? Are you thinking of having an independent variable comparing two groups on something? If so, what is it? What are the conditions? And then also a little bit of a literature search as well. So thinking about a background. You might even start drafting up like an introduction to put into the abstract, but ultimately also the application form. By going through that process of starting to write an introduction, what you're doing is actually needing to go back and forth to that literature, and it helps you with the design aspect of your study as well. So that's probably what I'd be working on. Cool, great, thanks Mitch. Riley? All good, thank you. Tim Martin? Thanks mate. Venus? Awesome. Okay, so bear with me, and if you do need to head off, that's fine. But what we might end up with is breaking you into some of those, or putting you into some of those breakout rooms. So I'm going to have set up 4 rooms here, and the first one is going to be, I'm going to put Harriet, Flo, Rabina, and Jessica. Okay, so you guys feel free. I think hopefully you've got a little click now up there. Okay, I think they've gone into the room. If you're not in there already, any of those 4, then head in there, and I might jump into that room in a minute. Okay, I might just go on to Tim's and Mitch to another one. And to that one there. All right, so hopefully we've all got rooms to jump into, and I'll just jump in between them, and then we can sort of head off from there once I've just jumped into everyone's room there. So if you can still hear me, there should be, if you can't find that, there should be a little more button somewhere down on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and that might have breakout room options in there as well. Hopefully you can see that. Is anyone struggling with that? Great. see if I can.